It sounds wonderful, but very complex. Is it any more complex than a traditional brand development campaign? It sounds like it might be.
I think it requires some specialist knowledge and skills, without a doubt. I've worked in the sense of smell for 20 years, but I don't think it's any more complex. So you can go back to basic marketing principles, and if you think about the 7 Ps as they are now, one of those is P for physical, and really we're looking at that the physicality of the experience, the customer experience. So the theory isn't much more complex. The practice can be. You have to have some quite careful knowledge of sensory signals and how those relate to emotions, and that's sort of an interpretive skill. But there are some quite robust processes and methodologies that we can apply to that process, and part of the reason I'm here is that I want to get that message out, because I believe in this very much, and if we can get that message out and get the industry aware, then hopefully, I talked about that 1% change in budgets, if it becomes 5%, then fantastic, everyone wins.
Okay, I mean, clearly you've got an olfactory obsession,
yes.
And you want everybody else to have an olfactory obsession, but give me another example, one of your own clients perhaps, who you've worked with in the past, who's really taken this approach to heart and really implemented it to its full extent.
I think I have to be careful. I won't name names, but I can talk sort of in terms of a category. One of the brands that we're working with at the moment is an antiperspirant deodorant. And in this particular, it's a male product, and in this particular area, everyone's setting out to be sexy. It's not Lynx, but if you think of the Lynx advertising, it's all about getting the girl.
Sure.
And they've recognised that actually, their competitors are all doing this. They want to actually be a little bit more mature about this, and they want to actually show that it's about inner confidence. So how does that sense of inner confidence come through? How should it come through in the total product experience? That's the pack, the product formulation, and the communications. So we're going through this process of analysing what the emotions are, analysing the sensory signals that lead to that, and starting to put those sensory cues in. And so the fragrance is less about trying to say, here I am to the women. It's about who I am. Either you like me or you don't. And so we work at a really detailed level. It's about the product formulation, it's about the packaging design, it's about the communications and the branding and the visuals. So it works across that whole process.
I mean, it's a real intellectual endeavour, this, by the sounds of it. How do you ascribe particular emotions, particular words, particular descriptions to smell? We
do a thing called perception mapping, and really what we have is a knowledge bank that perfumers have developed over centuries, really, about, if we're talking specifically smell, and this applies across all 5 senses, but smell, for example, we know that certain fragrance compounds will elicit particular emotions in consumers pretty much universally across the globe. So we can map emotions to smell compounds. So what we can do is almost reverse that process. So once we've defined the emotions that we want our brand to own and what we want to be, how we want to be perceived as different to our competition, if we build those sensory cues into that product experience, then that's starting to create ownership for us of that particular emotional space. So that's the perception mapping that we go through. And we map it, that total experience across all 5 senses, and then we know that the sensory cues are delivering us into that emotional space, whatever it is that we choose for our brand.
So we talked a little bit about sight and its limitations. We've talked a bit about smell. But what about the others? What about the other senses? Taste, for example. Well,
taste is very much associated with smell. So the process for smell and taste are very closely linked. Actually, we think that about 80–90% of the sense of taste is actually derived through smell. And anecdotally, we know that if we've got a cold, we can't really taste our food. Actually, the flavour molecules that we put into our mouth travel up to what's called the retronasal canal at the back of our nose, and we smell the taste. So the process is exactly the same, really. So that if you're creating a food product and you want to differentiate that into a particular segment or an emotional state, then you can do the same process. Some of the others are interesting, like touch, often I think overlooked. And it's quite hard to interpret, often through product, although, I mean, if you think of the shampoo or deodorant example, it's the formulation of the shampoo. And so, there's been an interesting move in terms of marbleization of shampoos, because that richer, more luxurious feel denotes quality, and there are beads that have come in. So there are little things that you can do. It could be about packaging format, or if you take this to sort of a wider context in retail, it's about the materials that you use in retail design. And we go through the same analytics, trying to understand what the sensory signal means from an emotional point of view, and then map that to the experience that we want to create.
In coming up with a sensory marketing campaign, how do you... and this is a very different kind of approach, I guess, than the one that most brand or marketing managers are used to. How do you go about evaluating the effectiveness of a campaign that uses this approach?
It's a good question. We have a methodology that we call Smash Your Brand, and that's really smashing it down, breaking it down to its component parts, trying to measure, using a process that we call best worth scaling, measuring the emotionality that each of those parts create, benchmarking, if you like. And then what we'll do is then analyse through this process, this Smash Your Brand process, how we then build it all back up together. And we set a benchmark when we first start of measuring the emotional connection. And then using this technique after we've rebuilt it to see how we've moved that emotionality on to this space that we've interpreted. So we have analytical skills and processes behind this creative work, if you like, that we can use to measure the advantages and the benefits that we've created.
Well, I think it's a hugely interesting area, and I think viewers and listeners will want to take this further, I'm sure. But the question is, if Cranfield were a brand, what would it smell like?
It's a good question, Paul. I think I'd start by asking you what the brand values were. Have you created a brand architecture? I'm sure somewhere you've thought about this, and we would start by looking at that architecture, understanding the values, looking at your competitors. So until we've done that, I can't answer. Sorry.
All right, Simon. Thanks very much.
We'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.